Well, first, let me welcome everybody here. I don't know if the volume needs to go up maybe a little bit. Thank you all for coming. I think you'll enjoy the presentation. We have three really good speakers on this particular topic area. We're going to start with Trevor Tombe. Trevor is a Doctor of Economy, or Economics, I should say, at the University of Calgary. Trevor did his Master's and his PhD at the University of Toronto. He's been with the University of Calgary for a number of years. He also has an appointment with the Canadian Public Policy, or School of Public Policy, and he has just an absolute wealth of information. The publications that he's done, he's written 2 textbooks on the area of economics. And well, what we probably all know him from is, if you're following at all the issue with the Alberta pension plan, he's written a number of articles for the Calgary Herald, Maclean's, Globe and Mail that have been picked up and distributed, I know, in the Edmonton Journal. So Trevor's specialty is really looking at pension plans, the intricacies of pension plans, what kind of process do they need to have to be fully functional, what kind of resources do they need in order to be able to pay out the payments that are required. And so we asked Trevor if he'd be willing to come, and he very kindly agreed. Beside him is Patrick. Patrick Imbeau is part of the national office staff for the association. And Patrick has a master's degree in social research. He is a senior advocacy officer with our national office, and he specializes in pensions as well. He writes a quarterly article for Sage magazine. You may have seen him in the Sage magazine answering questions around pensions, etc. But that's his area of expertise. I'm probably not going to get the name 100% right, but Patrick is a technical advisor to the Public Service Pension Advisory Committee. I think I got that right.
Council.
Council. And so his expertise isn't just for us. He actually provides that to central organization for the government. And finally, somebody who probably needs no introduction, Roy Goodall. Roy is our president. Roy has been with our association for a number of years now. He was with the military for, I think it's 38 years in the military. He retired. He served on a number of boards, the the Calgary Police Board, the Co-op Board in Calgary. And a number of years ago, he went and joined our association and signed up with the Calgary branch. And I think he did every role that there is in the Calgary branch, ending up as the president. He did the treasurer role, vice president, past president, you name it, he did it. And then he went to the national board a number of years ago, and he's done the same thing there. He started as a director, became the vice president of our association, and a couple of years ago was elected as the president. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Roy, and Roy's going to talk to you just a little bit about kind of why this is such a critical, important issue. And then we were going to turn it over to our 2 speakers.
Thank you, Rick. I am Roy Goodall. There's a possibility I could become an instant hit on TV here if I step back and fall off this stool. And Trevor and Patrick are in somewhat the same position. Their table can fall off the bench or the stools they're on, or they could fall backwards. So hopefully we will not make the local news tonight. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. The Edmonton branch is hosting this presentation, and it's enabling us to hear from both Patrick and Trevor. Now, after the Alberta government presented its report, the report it commissioned with the idea of replacing the Canada Pension Plan with an Alberta Pension Plan, the National Office conducted a survey of our members to see whether they support this concept. Over 10,000 people responded within 24 hours. 95% of them opposed the replacement of CPP with an APP. And when asked whether the association get involved in the defense of the CPP, 98% of them said yes, get on with it. So we have been doing that since then. The Canada Pension Plan is one of the largest pension plans in the world, with assets that are sustainable for at least 75 years, according to the chief actuary. Canada Pension Plan is a cornerstone of retirement for many Canadians, with 21 million participants accessing a portable, secure source of retirement income. It's portable because you can retire in St. John's, Newfoundland, to Victoria, BC, and draw the pension you contributed to for all of the years that you were working. At the association, we advocate for all members' pensions and for secure pensions for all Canadians, including the Canada Pension Plan. Currently, our members are concerned that they may lose the Canada Pension Plan and be forced to join the Alberta Pension Plan. And that is only the people in Alberta. So they are concerned. We're going to start today's presentation with a presentation by Trevor, followed by one by Patrick, or have I got it wrong? Patrick, are you going first?
Yeah, I'll explain.
Okay, Patrick and Trevor will each present to you for about 30 minutes, and then we'll turn to the questions that you have submitted, you and other members, and I will ask those questions in turn to Patrick and to Trevor, and so we'll have the question, we'll get their answer. Okay, so Patrick or Trevor, over to you. Thank you.
So, what we're going to do is I have a few slides just explaining briefly what the CPP is, a bit of the history of the CPP, and then I'll pass it over to Trevor so he can go into a lot more of the detail. And then I'll talk about what's been happening in Alberta for the last year or so. So, very briefly, how pensions work in Canada is that we have a multi-source retirement income system. So you're expected to have various sources of retirement income. A lot of people talk about it like a stool where you have different legs that support your retirement. To start off, you have your workplace savings, so a group RRSP, defined benefit plans, like our members, defined contribution plans, target plans, et cetera. There's a variety of different plans. Private savings is another one of the legs, RRSP, TFSA, your personal savings. Sometimes people talk about a home as part of that. And then we have old age security, which is offered to all Canadians when they reach 65 years old, and the guaranteed income supplement, which is a supplement for those that do not meet a floor of income. And finally, the thing that we're here to talk about, the Canada Pension Plan, which is, it was introduced in 1966. Trevor will talk a bit more about the creation of it, so I'll leave that to him. But the idea was having a pension plan that could replace a part of your income. Originally it was about 25%. Over the years that's changed. So in 1997 was the first time where we saw big changes in the CPP reform agreement. Essentially, it was realized that if we were going to continue with the CPP as it was not going to be sustainable going forward. So there needed to be reforms. So that was the first time that we had a really big reform of the system. And that included the creation of the CPPIB Act and CPP investments. So that's when those funds became invested. Again, Trevor will probably talk about this a little bit more. And going into 2007 is when they really took on an active management strategy, which means that they got really involved in the investment of the funds in the pension plan. It wasn't just kind of sticking them into equities and waiting or government bonds. It was a lot more active, as they have been for the last 16, 17 years. And then in 2019, the federal government decided that our current system in Canada is not leaving folks with enough in retirement. A lot of people do not have access to a defined benefit plan, defined contribution, any kind of pension really. And so they wanted to increase how much people receive from the CPP and how much your income is replaced. And so they increased the contribution rates, and now it's essentially supposed to replace, it's gone from 25% to 33%. And that was phased in over the last few years. Some quick facts. These are numbers from 2021. There's 21 million Canadians who participate in the CPP. About 2.2 million Albertans that contribute, with 640,000 beneficiaries. The CPP ranks as one of the top global pension funds in terms of returns. Every year, if you look at the list, they are right near the top, if not the top. The CPP is independently governed, so it is not governed by the federal government. Justin Trudeau has nothing to say in what we invest or what the CPP-IB invests in. They have offices around the world in Toronto, Hong Kong, New York, Mumbai, they're everywhere. And as of March 31st, 2024, they have $632 billion in assets, and they had 8% net return. And according to the chief actuary, as Roy said, the CPP is sustainable for at least the next 75 years. I won't go over this because we already talked about that. Roy talked about the poll that we conducted, where we can see that our members are very much in favor of protecting the CPP. But before moving on to my next section, I will pass it over to Trevor. So it'll take 2 seconds. Oops.
That's fine.
All right.
Great. Okay, well, it's great to be here. Thanks for everyone for coming out. And I enjoy few topics more than this one, certainly over the past year. It's been quite an interesting conversation that's been had here in Alberta and around the country. And so what I wanted to do today is give you some details around that debate that we've been having in Alberta, what an Alberta pension plan is, where that idea came from, what the plan might or might not look like, what that depends on, and what some of the risks would be were we to separate from the CPP and create a separate provincial plan. And I think the first important point I want to make is that it is not itself a new idea. We've been having conversations about the potential for an Alberta pension plan since the CPP itself was created. Even during debates within the House of Commons, at the time when they were setting up the Canada Pension Plan, there would be questions from members of Parliament to the minister responsible about what it would mean if Alberta were to leave the CPP, what that would look like, how would we handle it. So it was an idea that was is as old as the CPP itself. But hasn't really been a part of, let's call it the, mainstream political conversation in Alberta for that long. It really first made its way into the political debate provincially with the early 1980s, the Western Canada Concept Party. So I don't know if that rings any bells, but it was a kind of a quasi-separatist party that rose in prominence following the National Energy Program and campaigned on a lot of issues, one of which was creating a separate Alberta pension plan. At peak, they elected one MLA, and it didn't really go far from that point. But interest in the idea did rekindle in the late 1990s. So Patrick noted some of the reforms that took place that made the CPP sustainable for the long run. Part of that reform involved increasing the contribution rate in the CPP. And so anytime you increase a tax or a contribution rate, it comes off of people's paychecks and payrolls. It's going to have some opposition to it. And there was rising opposition to it in Alberta. And the Minister of Finance at the time, Stockwell Day, himself personally was pretty interested in the idea, commissioned some reports, included some analysis in Budget 2000, tried to get the ball rolling, but Premier Klein wasn't really on board with moving that forward in a meaningful way, and it sort of died around 2000. But fast forward a few years, And after oil prices fell in 2015 and 2016, creating a really deep and long-lasting recession in Alberta, combined with concerns around federal policy changes in lots of different areas, this sense of there being unfairness within the Canadian Federation did rise among some in Alberta. And so the government created what they called the Fair Deal Panel to look at a lot of different issues, and I'm not going to get into all of the issues that they explored, but one of the things they explored and recommended was for Alberta to consider leaving the Canada Pension Plan and setting up its own. And of course, 2020, a lot of other things were going on at the time, and so the recommendations of the Fair Deal Panel was not top of the priority list for the government, so it did take some time, but fall of last year, September of 2023, the government did decide to move forward and start this engagement with Albertans around the idea, and that's sort of what sparked the conversation that we're still continuing to have today. They set up an engagement panel chaired by former Finance Minister Jim Dinning to travel the province, have conversations, and dare I say, promote the idea of Alberta leaving the Canada Pension Plan and putting in the window some analysis that was commissioned for the government of Alberta that kind of quantified what some of the potential implications of an Alberta pension plan would be. And so they highlight a couple of key numbers. And if you pop on to the Alberta Engagement Panel website, these are pretty prominent. $5 billion in benefits to workers and businesses from lower contribution rates if Alberta were to leave, equivalent to about $2,800 per year at most, split between employees and employers. Those are for those individuals who have income at the maximum or beyond. And $334 billion in assets that would be transferred from the CPP to the Canada Pension Plan. And that's the big number here that has rightly received a lot of attention since. But they also note kind of something distinct from the quantifiable costs and benefits of an Alberta pension plan: more Alberta, less Ottawa. And so you can see it tied into these other broader concerns around the functioning of the Federation, independent of what you might think about the merits of the pension plan idea itself. So I'm going to dig in particular, into that $334 billion number. Because as you can imagine, any pension plan that starts with a lot of assets is going to be more sustainable and easier to manage than a pension plan that starts with a small amount of initial assets. So how much it receives up front from the CPP is very important. So the analysis that the government commissioned concluded that Alberta would receive 53% of the Canada Pension Plan assets were Alberta to leave. Right? Some other analysis that I put forward at the same time as the government's that was released concluded a slightly different number, at about 20% of the Canada Pension Plan assets would be paid out to Alberta were it to leave. And for context, Alberta is about 16% of the total contributors. And you'd kind of expect a little higher than 16% because incomes and wages are higher in Alberta than elsewhere. And there's some other aspects of the calculation that I'll talk about in a bit. But you can see these are wildly different numbers. It's going to have a pretty big implication for what an Alberta pension plan looks like. And so largely as a result of these two very different interpretations of what an Alberta pension plan might look like, the federal government asked the Chief Actuary of Canada to do their own independent assessment, their own interpretation of the Canada Pension Plan Act, crunching some of the numbers using their own data, which I should say quite clearly is better than the data that both myself and the government's analysis had at their disposal. We haven't yet received that report yet, but it was committed to in the fall. I was sort of hoping that we would have it today, and I can unpack some of that for you, but we might see it in a matter of weeks. I don't know, maybe it'll stretch into the new year, but it's coming. It is definitely in the works. So it's not just about the initial assets, that's very important, but Alberta does have a kind of a baked-in advantage just due to demographics. Average age in Alberta is about 3 years below the rest of the country. So independent of how much assets Alberta would have upon starting its own separate pension plan, a younger population is also just easier to sustain a pension plan, just because for any given individual randomly selected Albertan, they're contributing for more years, a little more time for those contributions to compound and grow in a fund. The benefits that are paid out happen further into the future. So there is an advantage demographically that Alberta has. And this is potentially why it's been an issue that bubbles up in Alberta every now and then. There's obviously that tension between the federal and provincial governments, and that's not unusual in Alberta or other provinces. But demographics too kind of makes this idea potentially attractive. A third reason, or a third issue to kind of consider when examining an Alberta pension plan that is also a big part of the debate that the engagement panel has been having is whether or not Alberta over-contributes to the CPP. So when it was first announced in September, the Premier very explicitly points to the very large gap between contributions paid by people who are in Alberta, employees and employers, versus benefits received by people who live in Alberta within the CPP. And that gap between contributions and benefits was framed as an over-contribution. And indeed, in polling, this is something that's pretty salient for many people. Asked if residents of a province who commit more to the CPP should receive a higher benefit, a majority, about 55%, say yes. And so it's an issue that is kind of appealing to many, but it's not as though the data is wrong. You can go year by year. We have excellent data on the source and kind of destination of these CPP flows. And since 2000, there has been a gap of about $70 billion, adjusted for inflation, in contributions by Albertans versus benefits received by Albertans within the CPP. But, and this is an important but, that doesn't mean we're over-contributing. Right? Remember that demographic slide a couple of points ago. If you're young, you pay in and don't receive anything. Right? I have a 100% imbalance with the CPP, but of course, when I retire, the reverse will be the case. So over the span of one's lifetime, it's much more balanced than at any particular moment in time. So if you take a snapshot and you look at the contributions versus benefits in Alberta, just because we're young, we're going to see this pattern. There's also the issue of Albertans moving to Kelowna, retiring elsewhere, paying into CPP while they worked in Alberta, but then moving to Kelowna or wherever else they move and receiving benefits elsewhere. And that's a challenge where the publicly available data can shed no light on this at all, but the chief actuary can, so we'll have to stay tuned on whether or not that's a big material issue. All right, so that's kind of why we're having the debate. But now, what might an Alberta pension plan look like? Well, for this, we need a little crash course in pension analysis. And I'm going to really oversimplify what is sometimes complex and subtle and detailed analysis. So if there are any actuaries in the room, just like give me a little bit of rope here, it is at its core a forward-looking exercise. We're thinking about a pension plan. We want to set it up in Alberta or Canada at large, and we want to ask, is it sustainable? What do workers need to contribute in order to make all of the math work with the benefits that we're promising to individuals in the future? So it depends on a lot of things, but some of the key variables involve fertility. You know, what the birth rate is matters because that's going to determine how many contributors you have. Migration matters too. Internationally, right, migrants tend to be younger than average, and that changes the number of contributors to the plan. For Alberta, interprovincial migration would matter as well. Mortality, projecting that into the future matters as well, because that affects the number of beneficiaries and the average length of time that they would receive benefits. And investment returns. Okay, the CPP and the Alberta pension plan are set up to rely in some way on returns from a pool of investments that Patrick noted is quite large. Invested well, generating returns, supplementing worker contributions. So the exercise kind of boils down into projecting each of these into the future. Okay? And of course, you never want to hang your hat on one set of assumptions. You do some scenario analysis to get a sense of risks and so on, but that's at the core of what's being done. So when we do this for the Canada Pension Plan, the Chief Actuary's latest report looks out over 75 years, out into the 2080s, and asks, all right, what are total earnings of Canadian workers going to be over that time horizon? And, well, about $24 trillion. Of that, we're going to be contributing a share, right? There's a contribution rate off of those earnings, and it totals about $2.4 trillion. Okay, now how much will the Canada Pension Plan need to be paying out to beneficiaries between now and the 2080s? Well, they estimate about $2.7 trillion. So you just kind of look, well, contributions 2.4, benefits paid out 2.7. There's a little bit of an imbalance there, but that's where the assets make up the difference. And at least at the time that this actuary report was done, they thought in 2025 we'd have about $600 billion. We already have a little bit more than that, so that's good. But it's that assets that bridges the gap between benefits paid out and contributions paid in. So that's one way of doing the analysis. A simpler way is to ask the following question. Will our assets grow at least as fast as spending from the plan? Okay, as more and more retirees collect benefits, and we are an aging population, there is more and more beneficiaries relative to workers. If assets grow as quickly as benefit payments from the plan, we're sustainable. And so the actuary projects out well to the end of the century here and says, well, today, assets are about 8 times spending, which means if we were to have no more worker contributions at all, we could fund about 8 years worth of the Canada Pension Plan just from the fund alone. By the end of the century, that's projected to be 13 times total spending. So assets are actually growing faster than benefits over the next 75 years. That's good. That means that we could actually contribute a little less and still sustain the Canada Pension Plan. And the actuary, that's what the orange line here is. They say, well, if we contributed a little less, what would it look like? How would we get that asset to spending ratio roughly flat? And they say, well, we contribute about 9.9% of earnings now for base CPP benefits. We could contribute maybe about 9.5. Below that, no, it couldn't sustain that. But 9.5, that's the minimum. And that effectively is what pension analysis boils down to. What's the contribution rate that basically allows the asset to spending ratio in the plan to be kind of flat over a long time horizon? So it's that 9.5% for the Canada Pension Plan that you should have in mind. So Alberta, what would it look like if we were to do that kind of analysis in Alberta? What would the contribution rate have to be? Well, let's step into it, one small step at a time. Let's imagine there's no fund at all, nothing. And the population's kind of static and simple. Half the population are workers, 20% are retirees, the rest are kids. This ratio of workers to retirees matters because if, as Patrick noted, you want to replace about a quarter of the wages that you earn in retiree benefits later on, then you simply take the number of retirees per worker, times it by 0.25, and that's the contribution rate you'd need in this simple world to sustain a pension plan. So with those ratios and a 25% replacement ratio, you get about 10% as your contribution rate. And that's not a fluke that's pretty close to what the Canada Pension Plan contribution rate is, right? Number of retirees per worker and how much income you want to replace. Those are 3 dominant variables in the analysis. And at that 20% retirees, 50% workers, that's kind of roughly what Canada looks like right now. Alberta's a little younger, though. We have about 18% retirees and 52% workers. And you might look at that and go, well, those numbers aren't all that different. But what's 18 divided by 52 times 0.25? quite a bit less than 10%, about 8.7%. So you can get big drops in the contribution rates from really small changes in demographics. Okay. Which is not obvious, right? So this is an important point. These demographic differences between Alberta and elsewhere is in part, again, why this issue keeps coming up, because there's this baked-in advantage. So just in the interest of time, let me kind of skip this slide here and jump to some results. So now you have a kind of hopefully an intuitive sense about what the government-commissioned analysis did, what my analysis did, and of course there's lots of bells and whistles under the hood, but you have a sense of what we were trying to do. The government-commissioned analysis suggested that the contribution rate could be 5.9%. That's a lot lower than the 9.9% current contribution rate, whereas mine landed on 8.6%. So it's a 4 percentage point drop in the contribution rate for Alberta to have identical benefits as the CPP, or a 1.3 percentage point drop. Okay, so pretty big differences, and that can matter a lot. The maximum benefits that the government is highlighting of $1,425 per worker per year, that's a lot bigger than the benefits that my analysis would suggest, which is about $1,000 less than that. So maybe $30 a month at most is my analysis in terms of the benefits of the Alberta pension plan. Where those differences come from? Well, there are lots of things connecting our analyses together, but the biggest difference, the most meaningful difference in terms of the different contribution rates is the assets. CPP paying out 53% of its fund to Alberta were it to separate, that's almost the whole ballgame for the government of Alberta's analysis. 3.6 out of the 4 is just from taking 53% of the fund. The extra 0.4 is them also saying, operate without a net, have no cushion whatsoever, no shock absorber at all. Okay. So let's dig into the asset split, because that's the most important thing, right? How are CPP assets split? First, we have to ask where assets come from. Okay, they don't fall from the sky, they do come from worker contributions. But worker contributions also fund benefits. Okay, the CPP is what's called a partially funded plan. Worker contributions pay some of the benefits, investment returns pay the rest. So if you look at the whole history of the CPP, about 95 cents on the dollar in contributions were used to fund benefits, and 5 cents on the dollar were contributed to the fund as savings. This varies from year to year. In 2008, it was nearly 1/5 that was saved, compared to about 80% that funded benefits. But it's that split of each dollar contributed in terms of how it's allocated between funding benefits versus savings that determines the speed of the fund accumulating over time. So just keep that in mind. The Canada Pension Plan Act also lays out a formula for how assets are split. And if you're going to remember one thing today, it would be this. Because it's not the normal way that pensions are unwound. Okay, it's a formula baked into legislation, and it's at the core of the public debate around the merits of the Alberta pension plan. So the CPP Act says it's a 4-step process. If a province leaves, and provinces are allowed to leave if they wish, then we will pay out to that province an amount determined by this 4-step formula. Step 1, add up all the contributions that have ever been made from workers and employers in that province. Okay, that's conceptually pretty easy. Okay. Publicly available data, there's some limitations, but you can imagine how that's done. Pretty straightforward. Step 2, I'll return to in a moment. Step 3, add up all of the spending on benefits that are related to the contributions made from workers or employers in that province. Again, conceptually easy. Pop into your data set, figure out how many dollars were paid out. Publicly available data, there's limitations to that, but conceptually easy. And step 4, do something with operating costs that don't really matter. So step 2, that's the part that's a problem for the government in particular, and for us knowing what an Alberta pension plan might look like, because it says you have to apportion the returns of the Canada Pension Plan Act by province. Okay, what's Alberta's share of the Canada Pension Plan investment income? Unfortunately, the Act doesn't say how to do that. It says the amount of the investment income that is derived from contributions made by Albertans. But it doesn't say how to do the derivation. And you can imagine there's lots of potential ways of doing it. So it's very vague. That word derived isn't defined in the Act, so it's left open to interpretation. And that's ultimately why there's such a big difference between the interpretation of the analysis laid out by the government and my own, right? It all comes down to derived from. So in the interest of time, I'll maybe speed up here. Sorry, I get lost in this. It's too interesting.
We have time.
So 2 big ways of interpreting things. One, my way of interpreting things, good, all right, is, well, the fund and the investment return came from worker contributions, some of which was funding benefits, some of which was saved. But how much of each dollar that Albertans contributed was saved? Well, I take the position that the Canada Pension Plan is a national pension plan, minus Quebec. But every contribution is the same as any other. It doesn't matter where you live, it's the same plan. The way that any individual in BC is treated with respect to their pension entitlements is the same as any Albertan, and that's the same as any Ontarian or Nova Scotian. It's a national plan. So every dollar contributed is split in the same way, I presume, between funding benefits versus savings. Whereas the government interpretation, the government of Alberta interpretation, is to say, no. The Canada Pension Plan, you should think about it as a set of 9 segmented funds where contributions by residents of one province are earmarked for benefits of residents of that same province and no one else. And if that's your interpretation of the Canada Pension Plan, well, then in a younger jurisdiction like Alberta, where you have more workers compared to retirees, you're naturally going to have less of your contributions being used to fund benefits. And those are the shares up there. So nationally, it's about 5 cents on the dollar is saved. But if you were to imagine an Alberta account within the CPP, where all the contributions and benefits are staying within, then it's about 1/3 of each dollar contributed would have been saved. I should say there is no such Alberta account, but if conceptually you wanted there to be and you were doing the analysis in that way, that's the split you would get. And this matters a lot. And if you like math, and this is where the actuaries in the room might perk up a little bit, mathematically, the government of Alberta's approach versus my own approach are identical in every respect, except for that assumption around how much of each dollar that's contributed is saved versus used to fund benefits. I treat each contribution, regardless of where it comes from, right across the country, the same as any other dollar in contribution. Whereas the government of Alberta's approach is to just zero in Alberta and only look at contributions versus benefits here. So it all comes down to that savings rate. So who's right? Well, I don't know. We'll see what the chief actuary says in terms of their interpretation, and that'll be an interesting aside, because of course the chief actuary is not the literal end of the line. I mean, they're very authoritative, broadly respected by everyone. I think even the government of Alberta is not going to make pot shots at the chief actuary's office in a political sense, but they could say, you know what, we disagree, and start a reference case through the courts to interpret the word derived, right? We literally asked the Supreme Court of Canada, what does the word derived from mean? Okay, so there's potentially many years just to adjudicate some of these uncertainties. But history might be a guide. And if you paid attention to some of the mailings that you received in the early months of the engagement, they pointed to Ontario Premier John Robarts. This is funny, I should say as an aside, because the government only knows of this quote because of me. But what John Robarts noted at the time was he personally claimed credit for inserting the withdrawal formula into the Canada Pension Plan Act in the first place. And he said the reason why he did it was because he wanted Ontario to have the ability to withdraw and, quote, be placed in precisely the same financial position as if Ontario had operated an identical but separate plan from the outset. Interesting. Because if John Robarts' interpretation is correct, then you would indeed apply that segmented approach to the calculation like the government of Alberta has done. Okay? And so in your mailings, this was sort of communicated as a done deal, right? A framer of the CPP has offered this interpretation, therefore we get 53% of CPP assets. But we have to go a little bit deeper into the history to understand what Robarts meant. Pre-1997, so the first 30 years of the Canada Pension Plan was very different than the current way of operating the Canada Pension Plan. For the first 30 years, any excess in the CPP was not invested in a broadly diversified fund globally meant to maximize return. It was very, very boring. The excess in the pension plan was invested almost exclusively in provincial government bonds. And how many bonds from each province the CPP purchased was determined in exact proportion to the contributions made by workers and employers in each of the provinces. And if you think about it in those terms, then the words derived from actually makes perfect sense. The share of the fund that is Albertans, that are derived from contributions, is really just the Alberta government bonds held by the CPP. And if you take that interpretation and kind of crank it through using the data historically, using the formula that I presented from my approach, you get the dark blue line. And if you use the government of Alberta's approach, you get the teal line there. Notice they're very different. So we don't just have to ask, who's right, who's wrong. We can actually go back hilariously into the public accounts of Canada and ask what the Auditor General accounts for in terms of the Alberta share of the overall CPP investment fund, and it's those green bars. We no longer do this calculation anymore after we reformed the CPP in the late 1990s, because of course it doesn't make any sense anymore. But we used to, and one interpretation of the Act is clearly consistent with what the Auditor General thought was the allocation of the CPP investment income historically. And there's no reason why we just can't continue on with that formula over time. Okay? So again, it's not a slam dunk. There are counter arguments to this. We'll see what the chief actuary says, but a lot depends on just how you think the word derived means and whether you think the CPP is a national fund or not. And if you do think it's a national fund, you get a very different number for the end result. So that 4-step formula. Okay, the first step, add up all the contributions. And I should say I don't know exactly what this is, but it's something on the order of about 200 billion. Okay. Then you apply Alberta's share of the investment income. Using my interpretation of the Act, it turns out to be about 85. Then you subtract from that total benefits paid out by the CPP with respect to Albertans. Again, don't know exactly what it is, but something around 140 billion. And operating costs is a rounding error. And you end up with something, there's uncertainties around here, somewhere between 120, 150 billion, I think might be reasonable. So that's the number you want to have in mind. The government of Alberta, 334 billion. Me, 120 versus 150, somewhere in that range. And the chief actuary, we'll see where that lands, but that gives you a sense of the range that's currently out there. Oh, and period. Now, if we were to withdraw, regardless of how much we would be endowed with, there are other considerations. Clearly, how much money a separate Alberta pension plan is initially endowed with, that matters a lot. But there are other risks to consider. One is Alberta's actually only allowed to leave the CPP, or I should say it can leave anytime it wants. The federal government's obliged to pay out anything only if Alberta sets up a, quote, comparable plan. But what does the word comparable mean? I don't know. It's not defined in the Act anywhere, unfortunately. And as an aside, this was also a part of the House of Commons debate in the 60s. They're like, what does this word mean? How does it get defined? And the minister's like, I don't know. A future minister is going to need to figure that out. But what's the government promising in its engagement panel? It's promising higher benefits if Alberta were to leave the CPP. That might very well mean that the federal government would determine that the separate Alberta pension plan is not, in fact, comparable to the Canada pension plan. Who interprets what the word comparable is? Well, it would be the federal government. Subject, of course, to judicial review and all of the many years of litigation that would result. But that's important. It might not be the case that a separate Alberta pension plan could pay higher benefits. It has to be comparable. Derived from, we talked about that. The CPP Act itself can also be amended. This is also kind of a risk because to amend the Act, the feds can't do it unilaterally. They need 2/3 of the provinces to agree, representing at least 2/3 of the population. Alberta's not big enough to veto an amendment to the Act. So if we do go down the road a little bit, there might be a world in which other provinces amend the Act to clarify some of the uncertainties around the word derived, and you can imagine might not clarify the uncertainties in a way that would be favorable to a separate Alberta pension plan. So that's another risk. This is also a good point to note that while Alberta can leave anytime it wants, it cannot rejoin the Canada pension plan anytime it wants. There is no mechanism within the Canada Pension Plan Act to rejoin the Canada Pension Plan. In order to rejoin, we would need the feds and 2/3 of the provinces, representing 2/3 of the population, to agree, which is not obvious that that would occur. So that's a risk. That's a risk. Another risk would be, well, how would we collect Alberta pension plan contributions? We don't have a tax collection agency in Alberta for many reasons, for many good reasons, I should say. If the feds decline to collect the contribution rates for us, as they almost surely would, we'd have to set up our own tax collection agency. And so there's real implementation risks. There could be many billions of dollars spent on setting up such an agency just to collect the payroll tax, which would be the Alberta pension plan contribution. So real implementation risks. My favorite risk is, I don't like any of these risks, but the one I find most interesting to think about is political risk. Okay, Eberhard here. I like to pick on Premier Eberhard quite a bit. He was a unique premier who did attempt a lot of interesting things in the 1930s. So if you're unfamiliar with the early social credit history of Alberta, highly recommend some readings on that. He would have done some really interesting things with the pension fund had it existed at the time. Right? He tried to set up a separate Alberta currency, for example, separate from the Canadian dollar. Even though, of course, provinces can't do that, but he tried to do it anyway. And lots of other fun things, imprisoning journalists that he didn't like, lots of fun things. A separate Alberta pension plan would be subject to no constraint beyond the premier who commands the majority of the legislature in Alberta. No prime minister can unilaterally change the Canada Pension Plan Act. It requires 2/3 of the provinces representing 2/3 of the population to agree, a slightly higher bar than amending the Constitution in some respects. But a separate Alberta pension plan would be completely determined unilaterally by the provincial government. And so anytime you're setting up something that is meant to last for a long time, right? We're talking about a pension plan. It would last for, ideally, forever. And you'd have 18-year-olds right now, right, who will be collecting their pension in 2080, 2090, many of whom living into the 22nd century. You do have to think about future premiers. And whether one agrees or disagrees with any current political leader, these are kind of at the margin, or there's policy disagreements here and there. And you have to think about the risks of having another political leader who is just kind of wildly off the deep end in terms of what they might want to do with the plan. And a separate Alberta pension plan would be subject to that political risk in a way that the Canada Pension Plan is uniquely insulated from. Okay? And that's an interesting feature of the Canada Pension Plan that the APP would not have and could not have. There's no mechanism that would eliminate that particular risk. Then there's more boring risks, macroeconomic risks. A lot of the reasons why Alberta is young is because a lot of people move here, in particular interprovincial migration, pretty favorable. Not every year, especially during recessions, we have net outflows, but for the most part, we're young because people move in. And given affordability challenges in Toronto and Vancouver, we might see some favorable migration for some time. If we were to have a separate plan, that adds some friction to workers who might be thinking about moving across borders, because now they're potentially keeping track of multiple plans, especially if Alberta is not comparable and aligned with the CPP, or employers now needing to keep two separate books, and it's kind of complicated in that sense for employers who operate across provincial boundaries. So there might be some friction between Alberta economically and the rest of the country, lowering our productivity, lowering our future growth rates. Then there's investment risk, and this is the last one, I promise. All pension plans face investment risks. Or I should say all pension plans that have a fund that's invested. Because you're investing, sometimes those investments do not pay off, and that's entirely natural, and ideally you'd have a professionally managed funds that tries to mitigate that risk, but in some years it's unavoidable, okay? 2020, the financial crisis, pension funds are gonna lose money. But a smaller pension plan run by Alberta relative to the CPP would face higher risks, potentially, because it's not as large, maybe making it less able to fully diversify in the same way that the Canada Pension Plan does. But its smaller scale relative to the Alberta population is also, in a way, making us more exposed to variation in investment returns. Okay, so if investment returns in the CPP disappoint, then we'd have to up the contribution rate to compensate. For the same loss in Alberta, the contribution rate would have to rise by more. Okay? So we don't need to go into the math or why that's the case, but a separate Alberta pension plan is more sensitive to any given amount of investment risk. And there's different ways to quantify this, but I follow the methodology of the CPP to illustrate this. So I take the same assumptions that we apply to the Canada Pension Plan, apply it to the Alberta Pension Plan, and ask, all right, what are the odds that the contribution rate could actually be lower in Alberta? And I estimate that it's about a 1 in 3 chance that a separate Alberta pension plan actually wouldn't have a lower contribution rate than the Canada Pension Plan because of its sensitivity to investment risks. Now, 2/3 probability it could be lower, right? But you can see the wide variation in what workers might have to contribute in a separate Alberta pension plan just because of variation in returns. So I could go on and on. I guess I'd encourage you to choose your own pension adventure at Finances of the Nation. This is a website that a couple academics have contributed to. Lots of interesting data, but one of which is an Alberta pension plan simulator. Yes. You can pop on there and you plug in whatever assumptions you want. Conveniently, the simulator can replicate the government commissioned analysis. So I'm not taking issue with their math, okay? But you can take issue with assumptions, and you can take issue with my assumptions as well by moving the dial any which way that you think is reasonable for Alberta. Or it's just a way to learn about under what scenarios the Alberta pension plan is actually as attractive as the government might say, or scenarios where it's not as attractive. So there are lots of different dials that you can play with there. So I encourage you to do so. But I guess I'll end it there and turn it back to Patrick.
All right. All right. So I'm basically going to be talking about what's happened in the last year or so, but also I'll touch on some of the things that Trevor talked about. So what would be the consequences of APP on federal retirees, since most of the people in the room are probably members of the association? So the CPP was integrated, a lot of pension plans were integrated in the 1960s when the CPP was brought in. The idea was that our members' plans were providing an appropriate level of retirement income for employees, and they were already diverting a sizable portion of their income to retirement savings. So the combined contributions under the plan and the CPP or QPP would be equal to the existing contribution rates. So they basically just said, we're going to integrate all of this. You guys already pay enough in contributions, don't need to add to that already. So what does that mean is that all of these risks that we're talking about an APP means that a large portion of your pension income after the bridge benefit would be at these risks. It would be acting on that portion of your pension. So things like the possible higher contribution rates, possible less secure plan, all these things that Trevor just spoke about would be a chunk of your pension. The bridge benefit, no issue there. That is a very specific formula, doesn't touch the CPP at all. So you would probably still have your bridge benefit going forward, or those of you who still have a bridge benefit, which is a portion of your retirement income that is meant to get you from your retirement to age 65 when the CPP would kick in. So there would be no issue there, but the main issues would be the same issues that Trevor spoke about. Otherwise, there isn't a whole lot of interaction between the public service pension plan and the CPP. It's very much just that integrated portion. So talking about the political interference, so in the last year, I was curious. I wanted to go back and look at what are the chances that there would be political interference in in a proposed APP. So just off the bat, I mean, comparing it to the CPPIB is very independent. It's an arm's length organization. There's a committee that names the people who sit on the board. It's ranked number 2 globally for transparency, so it's a very transparent plan. If we were to compare it to what an APP would be, as Trevor described, there is a lot of risk for political interference. And I was like, would they take that on? One of the first proposals that I looked at was in 2001, there was something called the Open Letter to Ref Klein, written by Stephen Harper and a few others. And it was very much, when they talked about the potential for an APP, they said it was about giving Alberta control over the investment fund. It was very much about talking about we're going to control this money. So looking forward, I was like, okay, well, what has Premier Smith said about this? She said in 2019, if CPP starts bailing out of energy resources, we don't want to be in a position where our money is being used to support solar and wind or other experiments. So you can see that she sees, or at the time saw the CPP as making decisions that were politically motivated based on for lack of a better word, woke agenda or environmental agenda. The CPP has a fiduciary duty. It is very focused on making decisions that are specific to increasing the amount of money that the plan makes for our members. They don't have a political agenda to invest in solar or wind. That's not what they're doing. But if this is the idea that this government is approaching an APP with, you can see it kind of gives you an idea of how they're going, what the potential for political interference would be. And then in 2023, she was asked on a podcast if CBC had a woke, the CPPIB had a woke agenda. She's responded, 100% is for the rest of the country, especially the big banks and pension funds, are going to be punishing our industry. I'm assuming she means oil and gas. One of the ways we push back is by repatriating our investment dollars. Again, it gives you kind of an idea of the way that they are approaching this pension plan. The APP survey that was sent out and launched by the Alberta government included an option to make a new APP focused on investment in Alberta, investing in Albertan companies. I'm sure a lot of you filled out that survey. One of the questions, preamble suggested Alberta could create its financial sector and diversify its economy. So it's very much talking about getting involved in the economy, having the pension plan become part of that. Political interference in pension plan administration should be avoided. Pension investments are for retirement income, not political projects, for the reasons that were outlined by Trevor. I've worked in politics, I've worked on Parliament Hill, and I can tell you politicians think about will this get me reelected? That's not the mentality that you want going forward on a pension plan. A pension plan is about the long term. It's about making sure that we have the retirement income for the members of the plan. So to give you an idea of what the reaction was in the rest of Canada when this was announced, the Newfoundland and Labrador Premier Andrew Furey thought that it was punitive to many jurisdictions across the country. I won't go through all of these, but essentially the feeling was not in favor. And so when Trevor was talking about how the provinces may react if they may choose to try to have an amendment to the CPP Act, if this was the reaction of the other provinces, including Ontario, and you're talking the political gamut here. This is Doug Ford, who is conservative. We're talking about Minister Conroy in British Columbia, who is New Democrat. All of them were talking about the APP on the same wavelengths. So it's possible, my interpretation would be that they would be on the same wavelength going forward and would not necessarily would not lay down in the face of Alberta wanting to leave the CPP unilaterally. In terms of the federal parties, Justin Trudeau sent open letter to Premier Smith, essentially saying that they would be fighting against the APP. Pierre Poilievre encouraged Albertans to stay in the CPP, and that if he were Prime Minister, he would protect and secure the CPP for Albertans and all Canadians. And then the federal NDP put forward a bill to make it harder for provinces to leave the CPP. That's a private member's bill. It's in first reading. And it's probably not going to go anywhere, but it gives you an idea of where the mentality is. There was a finance minister's meeting in November of last year, and that's when the agreement on the chief actuary's proposal took place. We expect it, as Trevor said, by the end of the fall. But in government, they always say, remember, the fall ends December 21st. So it means they have a little more time. And honestly, if they don't do it by then, it's probably going to be in this spring. So what have they done? What has the Alberta government done since they spoke about this? There was the open survey, and the results have yet to be shared, much to the dismay of a lot of media personalities who have been writing op-eds asking for this. On November 2nd, the Alberta government also introduced the Alberta Pension Protection Act. Very briefly, the Lieutenant Governor in Council would order, it included that the Lieutenant Governor in Council would order the holding of a referendum, determine the question and whether it is binding. The government must also allow for a referendum before moving forward with an APP. The assets transferred from the CPP must be used for the purposes of a provincial pension plan. And finally, the benefits and contribution rates provided by an APP must be better or comparable to the CPP as it read on the date the APP was created. The CPPIB, some people have been like, well, how have they reacted? Well, they're nonpartisan, but obviously they've been somewhat unhappy about this. There was an open letter that they wrote criticizing the Alberta government's outreach and survey, alleging that it showed undisguised bias to direct opinions rather than seek them. They hired a third-party public engagement consultant to evaluate that, and they essentially said the same thing. The Alberta government just basically, the finance minister said, the CPP has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. So that was their reaction to the survey being called, being called into question. They've also organized regional meetings, but not specifically on the APP. They do this all the time. But those meetings, if you've been around, have been very well attended. And there have been hundreds and hundreds of people at these meetings. So obviously this is gaining a lot of interest. But they've chosen mostly to just speak about how great they are as opposed to be very on the attack. Latest developments, the Chief Actuary report is still outstanding. Polls, the polls back in January and February found that 40% of the UCP voters supported the idea, while only 4% of NDP voters did. And on total, you're talking about 22% of Albertans that supported the idea of an Alberta pension plan. And since then, not a whole lot of polling, not a whole lot of discussion about some op-eds, but there hasn't been a whole lot of focus. I think that the media may be waiting for the same thing we are, which is the Chief Actuary report. The last thing, which is kind of basically where I think the government's idea is on this at the moment. In September, Danielle Smith appeared on a podcast where she said, when we get that number, so she's talking about the Chief Actuary report, we'll have to decide if they're being unrealistic and unreasonable about it. If it's equal to per capita, then that means I'd have to tell Albertans it's about $93 billion that would be transferred. At that number, we wouldn't be able to reduce your premiums, and we wouldn't be able to increase your benefits. Is it still worth it? Is the juice still worth the squeeze? So if that's the approach that she's taking right now, she seems a bit more conciliatory than she was last year. That being said, she did say, I promise you, if we get those numbers in the fall, we will go back out again and we will hear from Albertans about whether they want a referendum. So that's the last thing I was able to find where she spoke about this. So that leaves us with a little while for questions, I think. So thank you very much.
Patrick and Trevor, thank you very much for your informative presentations. It's now time to move to the question and answer portion of our discussion, where I'll be posing questions submitted in advance by our audience, those who are in the room and those who are online. And then I'll ask either Patrick or Trevor to answer it. So I will try and rotate the questions to ensure that I don't ask Patrick the first 20 questions and Trevor the last 30. We'll alternate them to the best of our ability here. First question. Previously, the other thing is some of these questions, you will probably say, hey, they've been answered during the presentation. That's true, but we'll ask them anyways just to ensure that the answer is clear and made available so that the person who asked it knows the question was answered. Question number 1. Previously, the Alberta government stated the Alberta pension plan would not proceed without a referendum. Is that still the current position of the Alberta government? And I'll ask Trevor to answer that.
It is the position of the Alberta government and something laid out in the Alberta Pension Protection Act.
Okay, could everybody hear that? Okay. Second question.
They couldn't hear it.
Oh, they couldn't hear it.
Oh, so yeah, the current position of the government is that a referendum would proceed first prior to withdrawing from the CPP.
Yeah, that's what we got from, I mean, like the quote I just put up is pretty clear about that.
Okay, thank you. Second question. Will an Alberta member who is already receiving a Canada pension plan have the opportunity to opt out of transferring to the Alberta pension plan? Patrick.
Would they be able to opt out of the pension plan? If they
Alberta pension plan.
I don't believe so. I mean, like, one of the problems right now is that a lot of this is unknown because we don't know what form the pension plan is going to take. But it's very unlikely that if this was going to happen, that individuals would be able to opt out and go into the CPP or stay in the APP, or I would be very surprised.
Yes.
Okay.
Just quickly following up on that, again, we don't know enough of the details to answer that particular question. And this relates to whether or not an Alberta pension plan would be comparable or not, and whether the two plans come to an agreement. So
Yeah.
Quebec has a separate plan, but there's an agreement with the CPP. And anyone in Alberta who works their entire life here could move to Montreal and collect the QPP. Right? You collect the pension that you start with, the first application that you make. And then the two plans on the back end make transfers between themselves if necessary. But from the perspective of a worker, there's no incentive to do one or the other because the benefits are largely the same. They're comparable. And that's why that comparability clause is in there.
Thank you. The recent firing of the Alberta Information Management Company Board is a current concern to our members. How are directors recruited and appointed to the Alberta pension, or to AIMCO and hypothetically the Alberta pension plan? Trevor.
Well, so all the agencies, boards, and commissions in Alberta are appointed by the government, and different types of agencies, boards, and commissions will have different processes followed at different times. But in principle, Cabinet can appoint whomever they want to any of these commissions or boards or agencies, including any potential future APP investment board.
Okay, thank you. Let's change the focus slightly. Canada Pension Plan. How are Canada Pension Plan directors recruited and appointed? Patrick.
There's an independent, if I remember correctly, there's an independent board that is where they have a nominations committee essentially when those people are named to the board. So it's all arm's length. It has the government has no specific say over who sits on the board or not.
Okay, thank you.
I guess I would just add that there's representation from all of the participating provinces and territories on that board. And so it's not just composed entirely of Ontarians.
Yeah, that's a good thing to specify.
Now, in a sense, I think this next question has been answered, but we'll ask it just for clarity. Why is there so much difficulty in arriving at what Alberta's share of the Canada Pension Plan resources would be? Trevor.
Yeah, so that is the question, and it just is because the Canada Pension Plan Act does have a formula laid out in the Act, but some of the words in that portion of the Act aren't clear. there's a critical section where the amount of the CPP fund that's paid out depends on depends on the investment income that's derived from Alberta contributions, but it doesn't say how the derivation is made. And I guess in general, some legislation dealing with financial matters embeds within it the precise mathematical formula that is to be used in the event that you need to calculate something. So if you read the act that governs the equalization program, for example, there's lots of mathematical formulas in the act itself. Here, it's just left to a set of words. And words don't map perfectly into mathematics, especially when the words themselves are vague. So the original language of the CPP Act just didn't really foresee operationalizing this section of the Act, and so it was unfortunately left vague without mathematical clarity.
I think the other thing is that it's not made in the view of the way the pension plan operates at the moment. As you pointed out, you were talking about bonds at the time. It was provincial bonds. You weren't talking about a pension plan that is invested in God knows what around the world, to the tune of $600 billion in airports in different countries. You're talking about infrastructure and equity. There's equity and there's real estate and there's stuff everywhere in this pension plan. It's not. They never considered that at the time because it was just provincial bonds. You just basically got back the bonds from your profits. Probably should have thought of that in 1997.
Okay. How might an Alberta pension plan impact federal retirees or recipients of the Canada Pension Plan in other provinces? Patrick?
Sorry, I didn't hear specifically. So how it would impact federal retirees?
Yes, if an Alberta pension plan is created, money is transferred, the Alberta pension plan is created, how might that impact federal retirees who are recipients of the Canada Pension Plan but living in other provinces?
So it's really hard to, because we don't have the details yet, it's really hard to know specifically how one would be impacted. As we said, we don't know what the agreement, there's no agreements yet because there's no plan in place. So it depends if there's an agreement or not. Our pension plan is written, it's integrated with the CPP. I'm assuming that there would be need of some change there in the legislation to reflect the change in the CPP. So now there's also their QPP, CPP, and APP. But I mean, it's a speculation on my part. We're really in unknown so far. We'd really have to have a better idea of what that plan would look like first.
Yeah, just following up, if it's a smooth operation, if Alberta does separate from the CPP and existing retirees are not impacted and we have a kind of agreement like the QPP, then that would basically mean we're probably in a world where the Alberta pension plan doesn't have benefits that are materially different than the Canada Pension Plan. So anytime there's a public commitment made by the Premier or someone else in government to say that an Alberta pension plan would have higher benefits, that's a red flag, because having comparable benefits is almost a necessary condition of having a nice smooth operation between a potential APP and CPP.
We're going to follow up that one with a question. It relates to let's say, the additional benefits that may be paid to Albertans. With an Alberta pension plan, what would happen to my pension if I currently live in Alberta and I'm earning this or receiving a higher return, and then I move to Prince Edward Island, where they're only receiving the normal CPP return? What would happen to my pension?
I guess this is the theme of like 1/3 of the questions here. We don't know. We don't know, because it depends on details not determined. If the benefits are comparable and there are appropriate agreements between the Alberta Pension Plan and the Canada Pension Plan, like Quebec, then nothing would happen as you move from one part of the country to another. But again, that's conditional on us having a comparable plan.
Yeah, in an ideal world where you have a plan that it has all the same agreements that the QPP has, Nothing will happen. Realistically, it'll look very similar. But it depends.
In that world, the Alberta plan wouldn't pay higher benefits.
Yeah.
So important to keep in mind, there is this commitment implicitly being made publicly by the government about the potential for higher benefits, but the existence of higher benefits creates all sorts of problems about integration with the rest of the country, and that can affect an individual's circumstances depending on where they move and live.
Thank you. When can we expect the Chief Actuary's report, and how will the difference between that and the Alberta position be resolved? I realize it was on the screen, but Trevor, would you like to try?
Hopefully in the fall. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, we have no further clarity around timing or anything in that regard.
No.
And if it does stretch into the new year, then you do need to wonder about the potential for a federal election, because in that kind of a situation, the report might not be released publicly, just because you'd have a caretaker government and then government kind of goes into stasis appropriately.
I think it's fair to say that all provincial governments are watching this exercise in the distribution or redistribution of Canada Pension Plan assets.
I have contacts on the Hill, and I've been asking them, have you seen anything? Have you heard anything? And they're like, we'll know the morning of. I'm like, okay, well, great.
The question is, if the Alberta approach proceeds, if something that, is there a possibility that other provinces may do the same thing? It's a speculation question. Trevor, would you like to try it?
So other provinces, while of course there's federal provincial tensions, Alberta's kind of unique in this being a recurring idea throughout our own history that you don't find in other provinces. And so the odds of this being something that's salient elsewhere, I think is very unlikely. But in principle, just in terms of just the raw financial numbers of it, a lot will kind of depend on what the ultimate interpretation of the act is. If the government of Alberta's interpretation is the correct one, and I don't think it is, but in that world, then only Ontario, BC, and Alberta have positive entitlements, and the entitlements add up to more funds than actually exists. And so it would create this incentive for Ontario and BC to think about rushing for the exits as well. And I should say that that's a really strange consequence of that interpretation of the act that doesn't exist under mine, where everyone has a positive entitlement. But that's kind of it. Ontario and BC would be the only other jurisdictions where you could make the math work out in a way that might support the argument, but there's just not the anywhere near the political salience there.
And like the slide I shared, they already asked the governments that are there at the moment, and they were pretty clear about the fact that they support a CPP that's as it is now.
Thank you. If the Alberta Pension Plan goes ahead and all of the ducks are aligned so that it can be created, the money's transferred, is Alberta obliged to duplicate the Canada Pension Plan elements such as indexing, disability pension, disability child benefits, survivor pension, death benefits, etc., and adjustments when drawing the pension before or after age 65?
I think
Trevor?
that comes up to what's comparable.
Yeah. The Quebec plan and the Canada Pension Plan are not identical in every single respect. There are minor differences, but on all the big aspects of the design, the amounts, eligibility, and so on, they're the same. So comparable is not identical. Okay. That is clear, but it's not very different. And so in terms of the broader structure, largely the same. That's the key takeaway. But if there's differences in terms of little cutoff dates here and there for when you apply, these kind of minor things, that's fair enough. But for the most part, the structure has to be the same if the APP is deemed comparable.
Thank you. This question has been answered, but we'll ask it anyways. If Alberta creates its own pension plan and we opt out of the Canada Pension Plan, is that decision reversible?
Is that?
In other words, if the Alberta Pension Plan is created and 20 years from now, the government of the day decides that the previous government made a mistake.
It's only reversible with a negotiation with other provinces. There is no provision in the Act at all to enter the CPP. So we'd have to ask the other provinces, 2/3 of them representing 2/3 of the population, plus the federal government, to change the Act in order to allow Alberta to re-enter. And that's a pure political dynamic that I guess you could imagine a state of the world in the future where there is a successful negotiation. But think about Brexit, right? Is the EU going to want the UK back in anytime soon? No. 100 years from now? I don't know, maybe. Who knows? But at least in the short, medium term, there's a strong incentive not to facilitate a re-entry because that then creates its own incentive for others to leave. So in any reasonable time horizon, I think the interest among other provinces would be to not allow a re-entry because a re-entry would only be sought by Alberta if things didn't go very well. And if things didn't go very well, then we stand out as an example to others about what not to do.
Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
If Alberta withdraws from the Canada Pension Plan and creates an Alberta Pension Plan, is the Alberta government allowed to direct the investments of the Alberta Pension Plan monies? Trevor?
Yes. So, I mean, at the moment, there's not really any rules around how that would work. And we see that with AIMCO at the moment. They have the power. I mean, sure, I spoke about it at length about where the power lies. When you have a single province, you don't have a bunch of provinces that can have a veto decision, not a veto decision, but it can push back against the decisions that are made. It is one government that is in charge of it. So they can choose how it looks. They can choose if they want it to be arm's length. They can choose if they want it to be more political. It really depends on what they want to do.
Thank you.
I guess I would add to that some clarity around, as Patrick noted, the Alberta Pension Protection Act. One of the clauses in that is that the funds would be used only for the purposes of the pension plan. Now, that sounds like it's committing to an arm's length management, but it's not really. No. What that would constrain is, I suppose, using contribution rates in general government revenue to fund public services. But it wouldn't constrain the government's ability to actively manage the fund in a way that is not seeking to maximize returns, but seeking to achieve other economic diversification or support for favored sectors and so on. So that's not restricted by the Act. But even if the Act said, have to set up an independent agency with independent arm's length agency, any future government could simply repeal the Act at any time. Because no legislature can bind a future one. And I guess that's a feature of our system, but it's the intergovernmental nature of the CPP that makes it uniquely insulated from that. Yep. And I should say, Canada is a very decentralized country. Like, we're kind of unique around the world, and that allows us to have a CPP with that kind of political protection. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. The Canada Pension Plan within Alberta, we have a number of employers and every worker contributes to it. Do we know what percentage of the total contributions have been made by federal government employees and the federal government? Trevor?
I do not.
No.
But that we could find out. But
yeah,
it's not an unanswerable question, but I have no idea.
Do you think it would have an impact on the total amount of money that Alberta thinks it is due?
I mean, I don't think there are enough. There are a lot of federal workers in Alberta, but I don't think there are enough that would make that much of a dent in the way that they're thinking on this. I would be very surprised. Also, the other thing to remember is like a portion of our membership, for example, would be RCMP and military and the CAF, and those folks will continue to pay into the CPP just the way that they do in Quebec. So that would even reduce on top of that how much money that we are putting into the CPP provincially.
Yeah. I should add, this might be something that we learned from the actuaries report.
Oh yeah, that's the other thing. I mean, so the other thing too, so as Trevor was saying earlier, there's a lot of this that we just don't have access to that isn't public data. So that's why even LifeWorks, the Alberta government's research, they say it very clearly a few times that they don't have enough access to data that they would like. And so they're making assumptions, which is what we are also doing, we're making assumptions. The chief actuarial report will have a lot more clear data and access that we just don't have.
Yeah. Which is totally fair that this data is not public. It's pretty confidential individual data, so only the CRA, the chief actuary, like it's very tightly constrained for good reasons.
Thank you. How would an Alberta pension plan affect other federal government pensions?
I think that I spoke about it a bit. For one, it would depend on what the pension plan looks like, because like I said, right now the legislation for our pension plan doesn't take into consideration an APP because an APP doesn't exist. And so those things will have to be considered. That being said, if it takes the form exactly of the QPP, all the agreements are in place, the legislation is changed so that it's just like the QPP, the main risks that would change would be the risks that we spoke about the Alberta pension plan, things like the investment risk because you're talking about a smaller plan. Those kinds of risks are essentially where it would change. But again, this is very much a hypothetical because we don't know if there's an agreement or not. We don't know if they're going to change the legislation or not. Those things are very much in the air at the moment.
Thank you. Canada Pension Plan is just one tier of our pension plans. So what happens to the old age security and the guaranteed income supplement if an Alberta pension plan is put in place? Will this work the same as in Quebec?
As far as I know, there's no interaction really between the OAS and JS and CPP. So it should be all the same, just like it was prior. They're very, like I said earlier, in the first slide of my presentation, I guess it's been like an hour and a half, but they are separate plans. There's one is paid out of the general revenues of the government, and there's very specific rules about how long you've lived in Canada, and for the GIS, what your income is. But in terms of the CPP, that's like a whole other. The CPP is more like a savings plan, like a pension plan, whereas OAS is more like something that like a government benefit that they're paying out.
How do the current administration costs of the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board compare to similar funds? Patrick?
As far as I know, most active management pension plans, it's very similar. I mean, it is a lot more. So there's a lot of argument about this, and I'm sure we could be here all day if we wanted to talk about the difference, the arguments between parking all your money in the market in equities, or having an active pension that's managed and taking on the costs that are included when you have an active managed defined benefit plan, or in this case, the CPP. But I mean, the costs are comparable. Unfortunately, they're very high because you're talking about major sums of money. You're competing with the biggest companies in the world. You have to pay for the best employees. You have to have a large institution. But overall, from what I've seen, it's very comparable.
Thank you. How do the current administration costs of the Alberta Information Investment Management Company compare to similar funds? Trevor, do you have a feel for it?
I'll defer to
Maybe Patrick.
Yeah. So AIMCO, I think honestly was pretty similar to other plans, but clearly the Alberta government thought otherwise and got rid of the board and the upper management. One of the reasons they gave was because the costs had grown so much in in AIMCO. It's hard to say. Like I don't have a chart in front that I know of that has all the different costs versus return ratios of every plan and how they're doing in terms of how much their costs are. You generally just kind of go with the net returns, and AIMCO was some of the worst net returns of these plans, unfortunately. The CPP was usually pretty high, the PSPIB does pretty well, Ontario Teachers, etc. AIMCO, if you look at the list of net returns, is usually pretty low. That being said, they did okay. Like they were still doing like 6% net return last I looked. But yeah, that's more of a, I'm going to leave that discussion more to the political folks because that seems to be a very hot topic at the moment. Just in terms of like how much were they spending, probably a little bit more relative to their net returns, but it wasn't worth firing all of them over, I will say.
I guess I would add that this is not relevant to think about the Alberta pension plan decision itself. Different pension plans have different operating costs, and some are more efficient than others, and I think there is an interesting debate around how to structure the CPP and whether we could lower costs there, but we're talking about tenths of a percentage point difference in returns when we're comparing costs between plans, and that's just very small relative to the much more material considerations we should have when thinking about an Alberta pension plan or not. And there'd be nothing guaranteed that a separate Alberta plan wouldn't be less efficient. Maybe it'd be more efficient, maybe it'd be less efficient, who knows? But we are just talking about tenths of a percentage point, and so I'd say that that's not something that should be really top of mind.
No, I mean, you are talking about millions of dollars when you're talking about the management of these plans. Like I said, the CPP has offices around the world. But relative to how big the plan is and how many assets that it has and how many employees it needs to manage all of these things, really you want to be looking at the net result. And if the net result is good, you're okay. And the net result has been very good over the last little while in the CPP.
Second last question. An individual spends their life working in Ontario, making the Canada Pension Plan contributions. The Alberta Pension Plan is established and actually has higher payout rates, higher returns. If an individual in Ontario has lived there all their life and decides on their day of their retirement to move to Alberta, which pension would they earn? The Alberta one or the Ontario one?
Yeah. This falls into the we don't know yet category, but if Alberta has higher benefits, then I suspect we wouldn't have the same kind of mobility agreements that we have with the CPP. And what that would mean is that we'd effectively then have two independent plans. And if you move in and out of Alberta, you'd collect an Alberta pension plan in the future with respect to the contributions you made while you were here. And simultaneously, you'd collect a Canada pension plan based on the contributions you made elsewhere. So if you worked the your entire career in Ontario and then moved to Alberta, you would just receive the Canada pension plan in that state of the world, not receiving the higher Alberta pension plan.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, I should say that would make things complicated for workers moving in and out, and so would add to that mobility friction that might cost Alberta's economy, but you would then just think of it as two separate plans, two separate books for both employers and employees.
Last question, and again, it's an opinion question. How could a small-sized pension fund, such as the Alberta Pension Fund, have advantages over the much larger Canada Pension Plan?
How could they have advantages? I'm not sure that they would.
Sorry? So there is interesting research and debate around how big is too big? Is there such a thing? Are there increasing economies of scale? You know, an investor with $1,000, literally, doesn't have the same opportunity to diversify that small portfolio compared to an investor with $1 million. A pension plan with $100 billion maybe doesn't have the same ability as a pension plan as one with $250 billion. But where does that ability to diversify, taper off? It's not obvious, but some whose opinion on this I respect a great deal would think it's around $250 billion. And so Alberta pension plan would be below that threshold, but how meaningful that is, it's really tough to say. But it's not like a fund of $120 billion would be considered small, right? But there might be some disadvantages, but at the margin, relative to the CPP.
Yeah, I mean, you can't, when you have $624 billion, you can't just park it all in the same place. And then there's only so many places you can put it. So like a lot of the arguments around why don't they invest more in Canada is like, well, where? They are investing heavily, but there are only so many places where the return is good enough for the investment.
Thank you. Colleagues, friends, that brings us to the last of the questions. I think Patrick and Trevor have done an excellent job of answering your questions and those submitted by our colleagues who are online. So thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Trevor. Before we go, Rick has a few words to say. Rick? And I'll move the stool.
You could leave the stool for me. That would be nice. No, so just kidding. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Trevor. Thank you, Patrick, for being here. It's an incredibly important topic to our members, to Albertans, indeed to all Canadians. And it's not a simple topic either. So we really appreciated your insight into it. Very useful. What we're going to try and do in the Alberta branch is do town halls on a variety of different topics. We'll try and get things that are of interest. So if you've got a topic you think it would be useful, please let us know. Happy to do that. Just an advertisement, our Christmas dinner will be December 4th. So if you're available and interested, it'll be the typical annual Christmas dinner we do every year. We hope to see people out for it. We do have a mega recruitment drive on now. There's pamphlets up here. The pamphlets are a year old, so the dues are a little out of sync. But other than that, the rest of the information is accurate. If you put someone forward for membership, you will be entered into a draw every time you do that. And I think the top prize is $10,000 in travel benefits and a $5,000 cash bonus. So very useful. And the final thing I'd like to do is, on behalf of the members, we'd like to extend a small token of our appreciation. Not to say that this is a topic that may drive you to drink, but it's whiskey glasses, a set of whiskey glasses for each of you, and a T-shirt from the Edmonton branch of NAFR. And again, thank you so much, guys. Thank you.